the last panel I'm really excited about is called Ontopower, Intersectionality and Indifference. In fact, the name comes from the fact that when we were surveying like the different papers, different accounts and engagements with the notion of difference, the first notion that came to our mind was the one of Ontopolitics, as articulated by Brian Masumi. Ontopolitics is a bit this kind of study of all the environmental conditions, naturalizing given definitions of life and their associated strictures, in a way that any iteration of life that actually varies from these definitions or naturally emerge as different. In other words, it's a bit of a preemptive power through which difference naturally emerges as such, even before they actually emerge. We found it quite interesting to associate the notion of ontopolitics with intersectionality, as the former actually allows to tackle questions of the later, as it highlights the tension between politics of difference and politics of indifference, the later being like both the indifference to difference and the recognition of the same. So our four speakers today, in the order of their presentation, will be Barbara Neukirchinger, who's a PhD student in Sociology at Bangor University, whose paper is called Critical Theory, Poststructuralism, and the Intersection of Gender and Disability. Then we'll have Sacha Kahir from the Edinburgh Coalition Against Poverty with his paper on Ontological, Syndicalism, Disability, Rights, Activism, and Metapolitics. Then we'll go for Stephanie with her paper on Queering the Whistle, Race, Gender, Sexuality, and the Snowden Leaks. Stephanie Figgins is a MA student in Postcolonial Culture and Global Policy at good old Goldsmiths. And we'll finish with Ramon Johnson with his paper on Technologies of Difference, a Technoaesthetic Perspective on Black Study, who's a PhD student in Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths again. So, Barbara?
Okay, hello. So I start right with it. In 2006, the case of Ashley, at that time a 9-year-old girl, provoked controversial discussions worldwide. She was diagnosed with severe developmental disabilities due to static encephalopathy, an unchangeable damage of the brain, which meant she had severe physical and learning impairments. An article published in Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine had described the so-called Ashley treatment, a massive surgical intervention that was aimed at long-term growth attenuation as well as the development of secondary sexual characteristics. The girl was subjected to estrogen therapy, hysterectomy, mastectomy, and appendectomy, which meant bilateral breast bud removal as well as the removal of uterus and the appendix. When Ashley started to show the first premature signs of puberty, her parents started to have thoughts about this serious treatment. They were worried that her physical development would cause severe problems for future care, as nursing staff are hard to find for an adult woman who is disabled. Furthermore, they were worried about Ashley's inclusion in family life due to the awkwardness of her body and about their daughter's general health condition. It was also assumed that regarding her supposed infantile state of mind, she would never be able to live the life of an adult woman. The parents believed that the surgical intervention could prevent sexual harassment, unwanted pregnancy, or related physical pain such as menstruation cramps or breast cancer. The parental concerns were backed by an ethics committee at the University of Washington in Seattle, and medical laws covered the accusation of compulsory sterilization by alluding to Ashley's heavily cognitively impaired state of mind. Cases like this reveal vividly how multiple aspects of gender and body-related social norms, as well as the commodification of society, are intertwined when it comes to the regulation and power relations of everyday life. Post-structuralist and intersectional thinking, as well as critical theory by Adorno and Horkheimer, are major attempts to grasp these phenomena from different angles and theoretical frameworks. Therefore, my aim is to investigate whether these approaches, which are frequently perceived as being in conflict with one another, can be brought together for a constructive analysis of society, and if their theoretical differences can be overcome. The interwovenness of gender and disability, namely the fact that Ashley had impairment and a female body, obviously played a crucial role in the kind of treatment the child received. Although the implications of a medical view towards disabled people is widely discussed, the mutual intersectional effects are still underrepresented in any discourse regarding disability. Closely related to the ideas mentioned above.
A tiny bit louder, please.
Louder? Okay, I'm trying. Closely related to the ideas mentioned above are post-structuralist notions regarding social norms and conventions that shape people's identity and role in society. Michel Foucault's writings on power and how it works through disciplinary action and standardization by authoritarian medical institutions and expertise gave a strong impulse to discussions about regimes applied to the body. Temporarily, Foucault's thinking on madness even developed some similarities to Adorno, who was also afraid that the Enlightenment could become a new totalitarian myth that governed social relations inexorably according to the terms of what he called exchange society. On the other side, Foucault argued that of all things, scientific reason, which pretended to be rational and free from religious superstition and dominance, proved to be a new force of oppression through its control and through normalization and standardization. He believed it was the order of Enlightenment reason internalized in society that manifested itself in institutional practice, especially visible in the history of madness. At this point, Adorno and the critical theory of the Frankfurt School had a comparable viewpoint on enlightened society, but their analysis had an explicit focus on the commodification and reification of social relations. Human beings are valued by their function for the means and rationality of exchange society. Or, as in Ashley's case, the girl's body was deprived of individual autonomy and was shaped for the demands of an efficiency-oriented environment because her individual value was not integral in the structures of exchange society. But postmodern thinkers such as Foucault, partly out of historical opposition to the dogmatism of post-war Stalinist-influenced left politics, partly because of homophobic tendencies in the French Communist Party, where Foucault was a temporary member, distanced themselves from Marxist-based theories for a long time. As a consequence, these post-structuralist and related intersectional ideas often deal only marginally with a deep theoretical analysis of socio-economic structures as well as the associated social hierarchies that cause ongoing mechanisms of exclusion and exploitation. Of all things, these observations made it strikingly clear that the criticism of society of critical theory had to be brought back into focus again. It still provides significant conclusions to the nature of society under capitalist conditions. In this context, the critical theory of the Frankfurt School provided valuable insights into analyzing and implementing theoretical problems. For example, the application of the idea of the non-identical, in German das Nicht-Identische, which is central to Adorno's critical theory, helped me to explain the contradictions and shortcomings in current neoliberal society in the context of the disability studies as a more radical and appropriate method with which to criticize socially motivated barriers. In an environment in which enlightenment is the main organizing principle that permeates all areas of life, the individual is reduced to a mere function. According to critical theory, the totality of this organizing principle demands an absolute identification that marks any deviations as individual problems. In the case of disabled people, disability is the non-identical that cannot be made fit with alleged rational processes that structure everyday life, and on that account questions the dominant totality of current society permanently from an outsider position. One point, amongst other things, is how social difference and inequality can be determined that cannot be fully grasped or solely explained by the criticism of capitalist-motivated purposive rational processes put forward by critical theory. Intersectionality offers constructive approaches that deal with the interaction of different levels of inequality and the effects on social relations. The timeliness of critical theory can also be investigated in terms of current forms of subjectivation. For example, the question arises if the depiction of power relationships in critical theory should be integrated with Foucault's definition of power in order to master the dynamics of flexible neoliberal working and living environments more efficiently. In what way can Foucault's idea of room to maneuver within social power relations as well as his notion of society based on this idea be reconciled with the understanding of society characteristic of critical theory? Originally, there were two cases that drew my attention and interest for this thesis. The two examples my research dealt with were concerned with the possible effects of the intersectionality-shaped concept of diversity management on disabled people in German universities and gender mainstreaming in a university context. Diversity management neglects the complex power relations between the different categories of diversity and fails to explain the socio-economic background behind the uneven status of these categories. Whereas gender mainstreaming does not adequately take into account that there are still gender-related social hierarchies that are deeply rooted in society and, therefore, often reverts to stereotypical notions of both sexes when dealing with the different roles of men and women in society. Unfortunately, the advancement of disabled people and women in a university context is still quite dependent on the availability of resources, especially financial resources. However, the allocation is determined more by academic competitiveness and the search for high performers than by the removal of conditions of inequality, shortcomings that cannot be fully grasped either by diversity management or gender mainstreaming. These pose the question as to why these approaches fail to recognize the problems of economization and their related power structures, and, as a consequence, this motivated me to take a closer look at the socio-critical approach of critical theory. Based on a more generic conceptual discussion, I would like to explore my thoughts further on a more concrete subject. As suggested in my opening example, my intention is to investigate the role of disability with a special reference to gender aspects. I believe this theme is very appealing because it mirrors the facets of the different ideas mentioned above. The whole field is still confronted with a lot of practical problems. For example, that of discrimination and for vivid discourse regarding views on disability and impairment. One of the most influential schemes used to explain discrimination is the so-called social model. It expresses the idea that the inequality experienced by disabled people is mainly a result of social discrimination. From this point of view, social barriers are not just medical barriers, but a consequence of public exclusion and, based on the ideas of post-structuralist thinkers like Michel Foucault, a consequence of a deficit-oriented perception of disability that is aimed at an adjustment to social norms of normality. In fact, the model has made central aspects of inequality visible and has led to a changed view on disability. However, in the last few years, the social model has faced increasing criticism by post-structuralist or feminist disability scholars because it is believed to offer generalizing explications that deal with individual life experiences and the big variety of different disabilities in an undifferentiated manner. In addition, there were also concerns by disabled people who pointed to restrictive effects of physical, intellectual, or sensory impairments on their living conditions, and who therefore demanded the consideration of these constraints regarding the perception of disability too. Simultaneously, the influence of post-structuralist approaches gave rise to an intense discussion concerning the significance of structural based on materialistic interpretations of social disability within the disability studies, so that representatives of the social model address incrementally the new theoretical advances in their analysis. I would also like to take the influence of gender into particular consideration, because gender as well as disability still suffer from characteristic types of discrimination. Even the emancipation of women has often been valued from the angle of how they can be deployed resourcefully as career-orientated employees, as gender mainstreaming made clear. Equality is not treated as a right per se, but as something that must be earned, or, as Rosemary Garland-Thompson puts it demonstratively, both the female body and the disabled body are cast within cultural discourse as deviant and inferior. Both are excluded from full participation in public as well as economic life. Both are defined in opposition to a valued norm which is assumed to possess natural corporal superiority. As a consequence, she advocates a conjoint approach of feminist theory and disability studies. Garland-Thompson believes that feminist theory has gained profound insights, methods, and perspectives from which disability studies can benefit, and that disability studies are addressing a lot of issues that feminist theory has discussed for years. For example, reproductive technology, place of body differences, particularities of oppression, or the ethics of care. Feminism and disability studies are comparative and concordant academic fields that have expanded the understanding of what is supposed to be womanly or respectively disabled. The idea of feminist disability studies is about the critical inquiry of identity politics in the support of a complex understanding of the cultural history of the body. There are also other suggestions for a common analytical approach. Nancy Hirschman, for example, agrees in many points with Garland-Thompson. She thinks disability studies can help enhance current intersectional methodological practices regarding the complexity of the manifold aspects and problems of identity and the construction of identity, as well as the particular circumstances of a personal situation. Hirschman introduces the idea of intersectionality within intersectionality. For that matter, she refers to discussions of commonalities and differences between disability and illness, or sexuality and women's studies. In Hirschman's opinion, it is the strength of disability studies that intersectionality is used to characterize not only differences, but similarities as well, and it is her concern to apply these perspectives to feminism too. In her view, the strength of disability studies is the acknowledgement of difference in disability and a shared focus on commonalities. Scholars like Garland-Thompson or Hirschman give an overview of a feminist disability analysis that can offer a rich insight in the cultural and social processes of inequality and oppression. However, it will be a task of further research to investigate the effects of socio-economic conditions regarding discriminatory factors and processes, and how these conditions shape the societal functionality of oppressive effects that are still underrepresented in related discussions. It will be seen in a further exploration how critical theory and its explicit account of structural dimensions can add up to a deeper and richer analysis, complete this void. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So now, Sacha's presentation.
No, do you want to go on and I'll just...
Yeah. In a way, like probably what I'm talking about just now is going to relate to, I don't know if people, all of you were here earlier on, it's a bit of a kind of organising lumpen politics in a way. I'm part of a group called Edinburgh Coalition Against Poverty that in some ways tries to kind of organise around unemployment, disability, various kind of things like this. In a way, though, it's like I don't know, like the term itself, Edinburgh Coalition Against Poverty, is maybe it's not a term I particularly like the name of. I think I'd maybe prefer something like Edinburgh Poverty Against Coalition, because there is a certain kind of idea of I don't know, the kind of 99% sort of idea that kind of has an egalitarianism that I think kind of destroys difference. And in some ways I'm quite interested in sort of quite negative ideas of the multitude, while coming from, to an extent, a kind of autonomous politics. For example, because our group originally originates in a claimants union movement that linked a lot to the refusal of work and kind of more like social reproduction around housing and benefits. But I suppose the question is, what kind of agent is there potentially for kind of disrupting the way our society organises? In the past, you know, this begins with Marx in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. He says, in the formation of a class of radical change, a class of civil society which is not a class of civil society, and a state which is dissolution of all the states, a sphere which has a universal character by its universal suffering and claims no particular right, because no particular wrong, but wrong generally, is perpetuated against it. And so this idea of a kind of universal abstract suffering that can't be brought back into society without somehow destroying the greater whole still seems to be a popular idea, for example, with Rancière. So I'm going to look a bit at Alain Badiou and Rancière in relation to kind of a politics of disability and welfare. Alain Badiou argues that the particularities of various groups must find a universality to escape operating on a level of a kind of syndicalism that merely demands recognition within the oppressive system, lacking a transivity that makes for a metapolitical language. With reference to personal experience of disability rights activism and utilising certain concepts of Jacques Rancière, I'll argue that what could be described as ontological syndicalism might be actually the first step in creating a metapolitics. Kind of starting with almost a kind of neo-Kantian perspective as well, that a lot of being remains veiled. The marginalisation of unproductive bodies, the disabled, the elderly, the infirmed, leaves our society blinded. Most of us will become disabled at some point under the category of ageing, and the narrow narcissism of our society leaves us wandering around in a kind of state of permanent adolescence. A severely disabled person faces an endless sequence of battles that intersect navigating space, conceptions of beauty, and the gazes of others. But conversely, though, I've known many disabled activists that have weaponized precisely this awkwardness of the other to the disabled body as a useful tool in direct action. In some ways, this kind of, I think, plays on the idea of the power of no part, but in some ways, there is a kind of blindness of also the system that in some ways makes kind of challenging it easier. I mean, for example, if we had, I don't know, disabled police officers coming to an action, we might not be able to sort of use, in some ways, embarrassment as a tool, which we've frequently done, where people with certain disabilities will suddenly play up their disability to kind of disrupt, say, what's going on in a job centre, or what's going on in a charity shop like that's using workfare. So there's a kind of strange tension always of kind of acting outside, which I think in some ways kind of makes kind of the Rancièrean kind of idea of a kind of more anarchist way of like attacking the system but never kind of actually entering it to a certain extent. Maybe at the moment more plausible than a kind of Bandiewian idea of a sort of universal transivity that kind of like changes the system. Looking at kind of an ontological syndicalism, I'd like to look at like the concept of the human strike. This in some ways is a thing I think that in many ways a lot of unemployed ex-workers we kind of work with kind of utilize in a way. A lot of them partly through a process that kind of originally started with the breaking down of the post-war consensus of full employment, which was masked by an increasing in benefits, particularly disability benefits, by Margaret Thatcher. But also I think this utilised certain aspects of post-Fordism, where workers were sometimes actually quite happy to no longer be working, say, in a factory or down a mine, and didn't want to necessarily be repurposed for some other kind of job, and in fact found life on the dole in some ways kind of better, with a sort of element of maybe getting by with a kind of element of criminality, I suppose. Another element I'd like to look at is in a kind of more anarchist syndicalist and kind of ontological way, is maybe a kind of direct action against language, which I see as still to some extent being quite symbolic and maybe acting more as like a form of vandalism than maybe anything that can, again, changing the greater part. Language, I suppose, is something that both Rancière and Badiou look at in his lecture on a non-expressive dialectics. Badiou says that no longer the proper name of politics kind of exists, so we're no longer Trotskyists or Marxists or Maoists. This has become exhausted. And then looking at the work of the anthropology of the name by Lazarus in his Metapolitics, he looks at the simple name. And in some ways, so, can we say that we're developing, I don't know, a communism, or what does it mean to say it's a politics of a worker, or a politics of being black, or politics of being a woman? He seems to think this is limited, as I mentioned earlier, and just operates as a form of kind of syndicalism that kind of wants to be recognised by the system. Whereas I think maybe Rancière, who also looks at the naming of things, including like disrupting the police distribution of the sensible, say in May 1968, with the title "We Are All German Jews." So a kind of naming becomes part of maybe like a kind of syndicalism in a way, a kind of joining together. I mean, another thing, a text which is kind of quite interesting that relates to some of the work that we do at the claimants is also recently been the Plan C. We are all very anxious, because they kind of periodise as well, like capitalism, its kind of modes of production, the Fordist mode being expressed in a kind of maybe physical or mental autocritique through boredom, and now in the post-Fordist era, where we constantly need to be flexible, it's a kind of form of anxiety that may be the kind of auto-critique of the body. But then they kind of seem to kind of want to kind of come to some kind of therapy as a kind of, I suppose, collectivizing, which I think is kind of interesting, but at the same time there is a problem in that where, again with the part of no part, once you negate the exclusion, you kind of ontologically disrupt it being part of no part, and it becomes maybe just a part. And so it's like, how do you, because in some ways as well, this is also what is the kind of language of recovery that's been adopted by the state. It's the idea that the disabled, look at the people in the Paralympics and things like this. We can kind of like, you're just being lazy if you're like still in that, wheelchair or whatever. This kind of sort of aspirationalism in a strange way is being kind of used against the disabled, kicking a lot of people off employment support allowance and invalidity benefits. Plan C they give kind of various sort of kind of ideas for this therapy, like producing new grounded theory related to experience, which I think is interesting, because in some ways, you know, it is a hidden thing. I think, for example, of anxiety, that, you know, I'm quite anxious at the moment, but I'm trying to hide it. It's a kind of normal thing, but in a sense, I think it's also what makes, in some ways, the kind of more, like, say, the academic world or the arts world, where in some ways the idea of the human strike appeared with, say, Clairefontaine, actually slightly ridiculous, because we tend to sort of actually hide our anxiety, work for nothing, all these kind of things, much more often than, say, the remnants of the industrial working class, who often, I think, I haven't actually sort of lived amongst, sort of grown up in this community, actually have a kind of like, sometimes I'm a communitarian, so maybe a kind of archaepolitics to some extent, but kind of very much sort of a kind of archaepolitics with no kind of end point. They seem to often be quite happy just being kind of lumpen, I think, to some extent. You know, there's a kind of like, there's a kind of the left, equally as the state seems to want the work, you know, the lumpen proletariat to rise up and become some kind of agency again, even to some extent, even re-enter work, you know, sort of thinking, oh, well, work was a better form, so, you know, if people kind of re-enter the workplace, then, you know, this leads to a kind of crisis or whatever that will produce some kind of political agency. And then another one they mention is constructing a disalienated space, which seems to me again to be a bit kind of strange. I mean, we can, you know, this was an idea that was very popular as well a while ago, like the idea of a temporary autonomous zone, where you again sort of practice it kind of escaping the kind of strictures of capitalist society. As I say, because I mean, it almost goes back to Hegel, the idea that some ways, if you don't form a kind of sovereign body, even from below organically, because I mean, Hegel in some ways has a big influence on both workers' councilism and syndicalism, then you have the rabble, which just falls off the body, the social body, as a putrefying limb or organ. Hegel used the proof of this, the social backwardness of the Neapolitan Lazzaroni, a class of beggar thieves made up of the poorest sections of Neapolitan society, who had sided with the monarchy against the Republicans during the French Revolution. But equally, there has been within syndicalism an attempt to kind of historically organize the lumpen proletariat, particularly in America with what was seen as the hobos. I'll just end with, I don't know, the slide was kind of linked to kind of like the idea of Lubberland or Cockney. That was a kind of peasant idea of a kind of full utopia in the here and now. And I'll just end on some lines from the song Big Rock Candy Mountain, that was a popular hobo song. In the Big Rock Candy Mountain, the cops have wooden legs, all the bulldogs have rubber teeth, and the hens lay soft-boiled eggs. In the Big Rock Candy Mountain, the jails are made of tin. You can slip right out in, and right out again. Handouts grow on bushes. I'm bound to stay where you sleep all day, and where they hung the jerk that invented work.
So about a year ago, The Guardian published its first report on the leaking of classified documents by Edward Snowden, who used to work for the security contractor Booz Allen Hamilton. And the story revealed that the United States, as we know well, the U.S. National Security Agency's bulk collection of U.S. citizens' phone records, the series of articles that ensued in The Guardian constituted the most substantial disclosures of U.S. government secrets since the Pentagon Papers on the Vietnam War in 1971. Snowden's leaks have furthered scholarly interest in issues of privacy and surveillance, which have been analyzed at length since the early days of WikiLeaks. And this interest has been from a lot of different perspectives. The legal one, how should legally the line between private and public be regulated? Politically, when is it acceptable to breach people's privacy? Is it in the interest of national security? Technologically, if we think about big data and metadata. But I think it is fundamentally a cultural question, which is how is the line drawn between private and public? And what is the significance and value of privacy to people to begin with? And in fact, the question of privacy has been a really important one for decades in critical race theory and feminist theory and queer theory. And the latter one, queer theory, is what I'm going to focus on here. David Bell and John Binney write in their book, The Sexual Citizen, Queer Politics and Beyond, that the public-private divide is perhaps the most fundamental spatiality of sexual citizenship. And Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner write in their 1998 article, Sex in Public, that the regulation of intimacy to the private sphere has been a foundational aspect of heterosexual culture as it is related to liberal democracy and to capitalism. They write that the ideologies and institutions of intimacy are increasingly offered as a vision of the good life for the destabilized and struggling citizenry of the United States, the fantasy zone in which a future might be thought, and the only imaginary place where good citizens might be produced away from the confusing and unsettling distractions and contradictions of capitalism and politics. So I think that to fully understand the ramifications of the NSA leaks, we shouldn't use just political, legal, or technological frameworks, but also look at intimacy itself and how intimacy shapes so deeply our understanding of citizenship and the nation. So it's in this context that I want to look at the national conversation in the US that followed the revelation of Snowden as the source of the NSA leaks, which focused less on the surveillance program itself, but rather hinged on the question, is Snowden a patriot or is he a traitor? This question, of course, is too blunt, and it erases the crucial questions involved in the act of Snowden's whistle. Who whistles? I think we have to ask who whistles, what are the capacities and intentions of that body, particularly as they relate to race, gender, and sexuality. How is the whistle blown? Whose ears is it meant to catch? And does it succeed in reaching those ears? I argue here that Snowden's leaks were read as a queer act, both by the US government and by Snowden himself, although in very different ways. Then I make some propositions about how the queerness of his act are made by relating the intimate to the geopolitical. So, I want to start with two quotes about Edward Snowden, and the first is from John Kerry, the current US Secretary of State, from comments that he made in May. He says, the bottom line is that this is a man who betrayed his country, who is sitting in Russia, an authoritarian country, where he has taken refuge. He should man up and come back to the United States. If he has a complaint about what's the matter with American surveillance, come back and stand here in our system of justice and make his case. But instead he's just sitting there taking pot shots at his country. A patriot would not run away. They say this stuff. So Kerry's comment is obviously an attack on Snowden's masculinity. And I want to pair this comment with another quote from the former US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, which she made this April. She says, when Snowden emerged and when he absconded with all that material, I was puzzled because we have all these protections for whistleblowers. If he were concerned and wanted to be part of the American debate, he could have been. But it struck me as, and I just have to be honest with you, as sort of odd that he would flee to China because Hong Kong is controlled by China, and that he would then go to Russia, two countries with which we have a very difficult cyber relationship, to put it mildly. I think turning over a lot of the material, intentionally or unintentionally, because of the way it can be drained, gave all kinds of information, not only to big countries, but to networks and terrorist groups and the like. So Clinton had already left public office by the time Snowden made his leaks, but her indictment of him is really instructive, and I think not least because Clinton has her eyes set on the presidency in 2016. Pay attention to the language that Clinton uses. I was puzzled, it struck me as odd, it's suggestive and not conclusive. Perhaps the United States government knows that it cannot prove Snowden guilty in a court of law for espionage, and so it's trying to prove his guilt in the court of public opinion. She raises three questions about the integrity of Snowden's actions: that it is puzzling or queer that Snowden fled from the United States before going public with his information, that it is odd or queer that Snowden chose to flee to China and Russia, and that intentionally or not, Snowden helped terrorists, whose bodies we can read as always Jasper Poir's logic in terrorist assemblages. I use orientation as my method to think through each of these three queer acts. Motives motivate bodies to turn in certain ways, and so to question Snowden's motives, as Clinton does, is to question his orientation in space, how he turns what he is facing. In queer phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed takes the question of orientation literally when she looks at the orientation in sexual orientation and the orient in Orientalism. When thinking of Edward Snowden as either patriot embodied or traitor embodied, orientation in both these senses is critical. I argue that how he is gendered and sexualized is intimately tied to the geopolitics of the spaces he occupies, has occupied, or plans to occupy. That is, Russia, China, and Brazil, respectively, as well as the geopolitics of the spaces he may not physically occupy, but with which he still comes into contact by virtue of the nature of his leaks, that is, the Middle East. Thinking in this way is to remember that bodies are gendered, sexualized, and raced by how they extend into space. It is also to remember that the categories of patriot and traitor are already always gendered, sexualized, and raced. So others besides the US government have labeled Snowden's leaks as a queer act, but in a different sense. Not in the sense of the deviant traitor, but in the sense of anti-normative, anti-parochial. Snowden himself does this. In the face of assertions that the U.S. counterintelligence community, from the U.S. counterintelligence community, that Snowden was under the influence of Russian intelligence services, one of his lawyers emphasized that Snowden sought asylum in several other countries before settling in Russia. That is, Russia was not an object toward which Snowden intentionally oriented himself. Rather, Russia is simply where he ended up. And while he may have settled for Russia, his intention is not to settle in. In an interview in June 2013, shortly after, by Glenn Greenwald of Edward Snowden in a hotel room in Hong Kong. Glenn Greenwald interviewed Edward Snowden last June in Hong Kong, and this was Edward Snowden's kind of coming out video, where Snowden reveals himself as the source of the NSA leaks. And Greenwald asks Snowden to talk about why he came here specifically to China, and he says, people will speculate that what you really intend to do is to defect to the #1 rival of the United States, which is China. And Snowden gets upset, and he responds that China, in fact, is not an enemy of the United States. He says that there are conflicts between the United States government and the Chinese PRC government, but the peoples, he says, inherently, we don't care. In this statement, Snowden distances himself from the complicated geopolitical relationships between the United States and China and Russia, two countries that are often smushed together because of their communist past and antagonistic military relationships with the United States. He says that despite strains between our governments, we are one people seeking the same freedom. Thus, Raoul Rao calls Snowden's leaks a cosmopolitan gesture, and one that is utterly queer in its anti-normativity within a highly nationalistic political climate. If that is indeed the case, then we have to ask ourselves, as Rao does, how do we make sense of the irony that Snowden's queer cosmopolitan gesture is being enabled by the deeply homophobic state of Russia? And I think that's indeed one of the ironies of the Snowden scandal, that on the one hand he claims that his act is cosmopolitan, but on the other hand he's exploiting the geopolitical tensions that are incredibly parochial between the US and Russia in order to avoid the reach of the US justice system. So the questions on the lips of everyone in America who sees Snowden as a traitor revolve around the idea that if his intentions were good, then why did he abscond off to such an authoritarian, homophobic, corrupt country? And two refrains repeated in the US media and the US government centered on, one, Russia's authoritarianism, and two, Russia's treatment of its queers. So the first, authoritarianism, I see is also tied with an idea of an unfree market, of the failed virility of the market, which can also be tied to kind of a failed masculinity almost, and the overdetermined masculinity of Vladimir Putin himself. Because Snowden's leaks were meant to defend the right to privacy in the face of an ever-expanding surveillance state, so his act was one that was really in service to the the liberal myth of the private-public divide that is foundational to capitalism. But Russia, however, is seen by the US government as a country that respects neither civil liberties nor private property, whether due to a formal communist system during the Soviet era or because of corruption in modern-day Russia's attempt at free market capitalism. And the second is Russia's treatment of its queers. In the lead up to the 2014 Winter Olympics in Russia, a lot of media pundits were commenting about how Snowden had sought asylum in such a homophobic country that really didn't respect kind of liberal values that we hold in America. And I think to explain that, it's instructive to look at Jasper Poire's analysis of homo-nationalism in her book Terrorist Assemblages. And she says that in homo-normative narratives of the nation, there is a dual movement. US patriotism momentarily sanctions some homosexualities, often through gendered, racial, and class sanitizing, in order to produce monster terrorist fags. Homosexuals embrace the us versus them rhetoric of US patriotism and thus align themselves with this racist and homophobic production. In other words, US patriotism allows queers into the liberal fold, but only when we separate good, liberal, normatively white, and middle-class queers from other queers. Our queers are patriots as long as they pledge allegiance to the flag, and shun those other queers, and particularly the always already queer Muslim terrorists. So we can apply Poire's logic to the case of Snowden and Russia. The US distinguishes itself from Russia vis-a-vis its treatment of queers. We Americans embrace our queers while Russia does not, but US patriotism sanctions only some homosexualities, namely those homosexualities based on normative whiteness. Thus, the United States can assume the moral high ground and criticize Russia for treating its normatively white queers poorly, yet the US can only do this through gendered, racial, class sanitizing in order to produce the monster terrorist fags, the always already queer terrorists whom the United States can never sanction. So I think this example shows how Snowden's act is kind of captured on both sides by two different discourses. The US government and others who conceptualize him as a traitor say that he's gone to a country that doesn't uphold good American liberal values, which now include a normative inclusion of queers, normatively white queers, liberal things. But on the other hand, Snowden's supporters, who think he's a whistleblower, may paint him as someone who carried out this queer cosmopolitan act, but they can only accept him on the basis that his body is not the body of the real terrorist. The last thing I'll talk about is following up on this idea of orientation. I talked a bit about how people conceptualize his orientation toward Russia, but a lot of media pundits also commented on his orientation away from the United States. And I looked at the coverage about Snowden's girlfriend. Mainstream news outlets and trashy metro dailies alike had a feeding frenzy over the girlfriend Edward Snowden left behind, Lindsay Miller, a 20-something acrobatic dancer who posted semi-nude pictures of herself on her blog, Adventures of a World-Traveling Pole-Dancing Superhero. Mills reportedly had no idea that her boyfriend of several years had the intention to leak classified government documents. Snowden told Mills he would be away on a business trip for a few weeks, and then he never returned. She found out why he had really gone to Hong Kong on the news, along with the rest of America. News coverage emphasized Mills' near-perfect life with Snowden in Hawaii. The pair often went hiking and scuba diving together, and painted Mills after Snowden's departure as a poor, longing housewife left out in the cold. In one story, Mills' father ruminates on her secret longings to marry Snowden and plan their life together. The subtext here is that by leaving, Snowden crushed her fantasies of a productive heterosexual kinship. How does this relate to the geopolitics of the United States and Russia? I'll tell you. Snowden's relationship with his, Sacha Ahmed examines how heterosexuality becomes a script that binds the familial with the global. The coupling of man and woman becomes a kind of birthing, of giving birth not only to new life, but to ways of living that are already recognizable as forms of civilization. And so I think that the media coverage around his girlfriend kind of highlighted how Snowden was turning his back not only on this heterosexual coupling, and also this nice upper class life he was sexual betrayal away from a country that accepts proper deviance, which is the United States, and toward a country that punishes its deviance improperly, which is Russia. So to see Snowden as patriot might be to emphasize that in giving up such a wonderful life, he's making a big sacrifice for his country, manning up, doing what a man's got to do. Such an interpretation asserts his masculinity in order to evidence his patriotism. To see Snowden as traitor might be to chastise him for his move, as Carrie did, telling him to man up and come home. That's pretty much it. My final analysis is just that I wouldn't read Snowden's act as Raoul Rao does, as truly cosmopolitan or queer, but that's not because of Snowden's going to Russia, which you could see as kind of, I guess, him eschewing the geopolitical relationship between the U.S. and Russia, because he could have really gone anywhere, and I think he truly did just go to wherever accepted him. But the reason why this act is not thoroughly queer is that it's captured on both sides. If he's seen as a spy, then he's someone who needs to man up, and if he's seen as a patriot, then he's seen as kind of this good nationalistic queer who's done his normative patriotic duty, and both play into this heteronormative or homo-nationalist discourse about the nation.
That's Tiffany. And now the last speaker of the day, Ramon. Oh, you need to plug it? Yep.
Just show you something real quick. That's
cool. Wow. So I have to follow 2 days worth of fantastic talks, so no pressure at all. Anyway, what I'm going to show you here is just a few seconds of images that are quite axiomatic, but I'm hoping by the end of the talk it'll become at least somewhat lucid on why I'm actually going back to axiomatic images within Black study to reevaluate and rearticulate the social situation. But really what's happening and what this talk today is about is sort of a beginning meditation. It's a beginning meditation, obviously, in my research and journey, which has been a bit disjointed and a long, grueling process on how to reformulate the idea of the study of Black people, and within that, implicitly, the governance of the other. So I'll go right into it. I won't play too much longer of the video, but it'll become important on why I'm going to talk about this towards the end. So I'll just stop it there and just let it stay. In case any of you don't know, it's Angela Davis in her wondrous pose. Anyway, so in this paper, I'd like to consider a question asked by Stuart Hall in the foreword to Claire Alexander's book on the art of being Black. But first, I'd like to explain what Alexander's book is about. She describes her work as a study of culture, not in an essentialized, fixed, or traditional heritage, but a continually created and invented tradition, which reimagines itself in each mind and life. What Alexander's analysis becomes is a meditation on how the identity commonly known as Black is both produced and performed, which she describes as being too personal and too complex to sustain, an approach that I argue rests solely on an often salacious temptation of empirical data or the reductive measures inherent in generalized notions of social belonging and behavior. Alexander's study is about the heterogeneous production of identity, not as a politics in response to and thus owned by the social, but as an interpersonal experience that both informs and exceeds its relationship with the wider cultural ecology. Perhaps Alexander's theme is related to a question posed many years later by Fred Moten, who asked, if the Black cannot be an other for another Black, if the Black can only be an other for a white, then is there anything called Black social life? If this question seems a bit provocative in the study of culture, then the text has attracted an appropriate level of attention that is so desperately needed to address the state of our human condition and the studies of culture in our social ecology. Within this ecology, and systems of relation that define and produce our state of being, They inform the ways in which we relate to our partners, families, communities, governances, and most importantly, ourselves. As we are all too aware, these relations are in crisis. Crises of power, violence, homophobia, transphobia, racism, and misogyny. Our crisis against the productive cultural amplifications that we like to so affectionately call the other. But these crises reveal more than just the other's reaction to systems that have gained disproportionate amounts of power. The other remains subjected to our own values of ethics and ideas of acceptable ways of living. The result is a set of social conditions that for the other forecloses the true realization of coexistence. We are accustomed to considering the other as an individual separate from the accepted normality, without paying close attention to the specifics of the world in which the other lives, not to mention our world as other in reflection. This space does not foster coexistence, fruitful dialogue, protection of each other, care, or empathy. The achievement of peaceful coexistence that fosters these qualities demands the validity of difference in which the other is not subjected to monosubjective value structures. It should be noted, however, that the more tranquil relations outside of these structures are not a respite or an impasse in personal or social development. They are relations to oneself and others as just being, or an allowability to be, not as an other to a specific normality, but as a being with equal rights of interaction. This is an important move in reversing the current of the cultural milieu that inflicts punishment against those that do not conform to an authenticity of group normalities. The expression of these violences are present in every day from the local to international level in the form of bullying, racism, race-based domination, sexual harassment, anti-queer sentiments, and a myriad of other violences that thrive within our daily relations. What the individual is faced with are not just the microaggressions of sources of power against the groups in which they belong, but the conditions that determine the individual's authenticity as a precondition for their belonging in the first place. In place are dichotomies of repression versus visibility that we have seen in familiar physical manifestations like the incessant war on terror, unrestrained incarceration rates, militarized border enforcement, and other axioms of us versus them. Ultimately, what I am suggesting is what has been argued fruitfully in discursive circles and quite frankly throughout here today, throughout this entire conference. If not limited in the scope of temporality, that the other is also subjected to an othering by the groups in which they belong, as well as the dominant forces of that group. The determinants of this social authenticity, which I define here as an expectation for conformity, paralyze the becoming of different individual realities. If what I'm proposing today seems to have little to do with the study of black culture, then first I'd like to extend Claire Alexander's statement and Fred Moten's inquiry at the start of this talk to debunk a common myth, a myth that assumes that black culture as a commonly grouped other has no others within itself, a myth I'm sure queer communities can relate to as well. The perpetuation of this myth has given rise to a monosubjective perception both within and outside of what we call blackness. Put into the framework of black culture, it is a state of lived experience called blackness that I argue, in following Fred Moten, that the governance of the self are more explicitly illustrated. And since in this way blackness informs the black individual on all levels of being, I contend that there's nothing more immediate to the advancement of blackness than the removal of the politicization of the individual black body. As such, in fitting with the theme of this conference, I promised you a question by Stuart Hall. If blackness is an immediate politicization of the black body, then how, Hall asked, do we bear our cultural identities, the signs and symbols of our belongingness, like, as some would argue, indelible number plates on our back? Or are the unities that cultural identities appear to constitute the result of what we might call a practice of narration, the invention of the cultural self, producing fixed belongingness in rather the way we construct, after the event, a pervasive, consistent biographical story about who we are and where we are from? Hall's question suggests that being black is a discursive accomplishment, a practice as reflection, as he notes, rather than an irreducible reality in social conditions that have not allowed for the extension of blackness beyond a political reaction. Hall's assertion invites us to think about or rethink the processes by which we relate through difference. Moving Hall's discussion forward, I'd like to suggest that subjectivity is more than a retrospective construction. The process by which subjectivity is established is an infinitely transformative environment of trans-individuating experiences that are both self-governing, energetic, and simultaneously disruptive in the operation of being black. I should be clear, however, by trans-individuating, I mean the capacity of the black individual to make use of the relation to oneself and surroundings to offer new ways of being and becoming. Following Gilbert Simonden's, sorry, I love saying philosopher's name with my American accent all the time, Gilbert Simonden, development of the process of individuation, the individual is always incomplete and finds themselves continually involved in new processes of becoming. The individual already belongs to anything that contributes to establishing relations, such as being black, including the relations with oneself. Simonden moves a step further by theorizing that the individual, whilst in the process of becoming, is simultaneously involved in an operation by which the individual forms consistencies of connection. The trans individual comes into view from successive operations of individuation. It is within the framework of this operation that my research conceptualizes black people and black culture as consistencies of relation. The emergence of blackness, therefore, articulates more than a group of people unified under a common defensiveness. Instead, being black creates an allowability to challenge and reveal political, economic, and social environments through the affirmative processes of being and becoming. I'd just like to take one break here and sort of explain the quick difference. What I'm not referring to is individualism, a Hegelian type of individualism, which basically says, you know, the individual is thriving for a certain self-gain and is governed by these sort of self-desires. Simonden's concept of individuation already pre-assumes that the individual is already tied into the network. The pre-assumption is that every action that the individual makes already affects the milieu of culture. So in essence, the individual action is the individual of a group. So I just want to sort of make that clear before I go on. Mostly, however, the individuated subject is a disconnection from traditional sense of representation, or a brokenness of being, as Stefano Harney and Fred Moten write, which does not seek to be fixed, since it does not assume a nexus of activity like recognition or acknowledgement. My research is lodged here at the tension between the expectations of black performance as resistance and the allowability for difference within community. Specifically, I question how contemporary black performance is articulated outside of a historicity that is continually altered through new forms of hegemony and traditional ways of performing black. But how can this new world, this new system of relation characterized by a respect for life and human dignity be achieved? How are we, as Hall notes, as Hall notes, divorce the expectations of identity? Irigaray suggests that such a provocation will require a sharing of the social space that encourages the projection of a different human reality, where one sees the other as irreducible to one's own experience. Irigaray argues that this world is constituted through respecting the other within oneself and not projecting the totality of what exists outside of oneself, as systems of domination often do. What Irigaray argues for is a conviviality in excess of a passive acceptance of difference that, as I argue, has failed multiculturalism, pluralism, hybridity, and other experiments in the relations amongst different people. In this way, the fundamental heart of the social is revealed in its most explicit realization, that the conditions of the human reality are irreducible to the relation of the other. Becoming would then be dependent on what Irigaray writes is an ability to achieve another world, another nature, and not our own transforming this world and our own nature. It would also depend on the circumvention of a reactionary posture that paralyzes black studies on postcolonialism, and I argue also studies on anti-racism, that falsely imagine that freedom lies in the dominant's acceptance or recognition of the other. Simply put, the authenticity of the social would have to become an authenticity that is different in itself. The claim would imply an aesthetic value is placed on the black lived experience. This value is not only a reality for the peoples of the diaspora, but it is a mechanism by which black peoples are most commonly assessed for acceptance. And I should note that the same tools used for authenticity outside of group representation are also used inside of group representation. And if you like to go back to the classics, Irving Goffman is very, very key in that sort of area, is the repetition of hegemony within environments that are already hegemonic. So I'm sort of arguing against both forms of governance, both from, if you want to use it vertically, both from the top and from within. Blackness in itself is already aesthetic. In fact, blackness has become an undeniable aesthetic power, black power. Mark Anthony Neal reminds us that blackness has been inscribed socially and culturally on black bodies. Blacks have often used blackness in their own bodies for that matter, to challenge prevalent notions of blackness. The subversion of this relation is at its most basic a radical tool, what I would argue is a technique of difference that would suggest what Simondon theorizes as a technoaesthetic process. Simondon's theories of the technoaesthetic forces us to take into account the aesthetic practices and techniques of governance over the self and another to reveal our own potential to change the tides of our social relations. According to Simondon, although we may typically associate the technoaesthetic sensation of the human relationship with the physical non-human tool following Heidegger, so we're accustomed to seeing the sort of human non-human relationship as, me putting a hammer against a nail, or I theorize in the most grueling form throwing a bottle at a Pakistani family at a bus station. So it's our relationship with tools. But what Simondon is taking it a step further and basically saying that the technology between those relationships also applies between human and human, and how we make use of the technology in that relationship to create a tertiary space that we can't articulate because it's abstract. However, it informs our next environment. So in this sense, the technoaesthetic is an intercategorial fusion or a mediation of experience that allows the individual to stray away from the norm and extend the contemplation of difference into both a technical and aesthetic system of feedback that is distinct from its origin. In other words, the relations between the individual and difference produces an excess experience that can be used as a technique for entry into other systems of relation. For instance, this is no better illustrated than in the aesthetic communications of the 1960s Black is Beautiful movement, most particularly in the symbol of Angela Davis's afro as both a new beauty standard and political message. Davis's hairstyle became a central call for self-determinancy and resistance for Black women during movements. Her aesthetic reasserted Black beauty aesthetics in the political and cultural discourse that has been challenged by the adoption of anthropological beauty standards in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The experience prompted Davis to reflect. It is both humiliating and humbling to discover that a single generation after the events that constructed me as a public personality, I am remembered as a hairdo. It is humiliating because it reduces the politics of liberation to a politics of fashion. It is humbling because such encounters with the younger generation demonstrate the fragility and mutability of historical images, particularly those associated with African American history. And what she's referring to is later on in life, she actually goes to an event and a woman encounters her and says, "Angela, I remember you," introduces Angela to her son, and the son has no idea, and then he goes, "The afro." And so and what Angela's basically saying is sort of the irony in that situation, how a cultural political message can be communicated through something that we take for granted, which are these sort of physical aesthetics that we wear. And later on in my research, I'm looking at the ideas of Blackness not as a culture, but as a system of feedback that is captured by the embodied experience for use in reconciling the environment that they're in. So in other words, the afro is used to politicize an environment that helps you get through other environments. Anyway. So as Davis notes, the popularity of her hair exceeded its relation to fashion trends. Through relation, her symbol of beauty revealed the reclamation of both the cultural aesthetic and the messages therein. What differentiated the adoption of Davis's style by Black women in the 1960s from 18th century thoughts is that Davis's afro, in a reciprocal relationship of a cultural practice, functioned as an object primarily experienced through her use of representation rather than in its contemplation. As such, Davis's analysis of her own beauty's impact on the Black Power movement happened retrospectively. Davis's afro did not enter into scholarship, as far as I'm aware, until after the popularity of the Black Power struggles. However, during the moments of her struggle, her style lived in excess of its relation to style. The afro was both message and articulation of political resistance. And what I'm specifically referring to is what Davis will refer to in several interviews is after this image of her FBI photo with this huge afro, and that was part of the description. They were basically stopping any Black woman they could find with an afro because they were looking for Davis. And it became a moment of solidarity because Davis says that not only did she adopt a style that was already pre-existing, but by politicizing that style, other Black women started wearing afros to give a message. And that is a very key moment because if we look at the peculiarities of Black messaging, that's a very key moment that adopts right back to sort of colonization and slavery days, where you can particularly consider communication during American slavery, where the black body was not allowed a corporeal way to communicate. And so they communicated in very visually aesthetic and oral ways. One particular example with that would be sort of the Negro spiritual, which right now we sort of take for granted as being a church song or a religious text. But really what it was a communication. Go see him on the mountain probably means someone's up on the mountain. Many references to Jesus and God, but mostly it was a way to articulate a communication that could not be articulated, because if they articulated it in a normal sense, they would either be punished or killed. And that has lived on. Was what I find particularly interesting in this reformulation of black study is in 200 years later, that's still being done in the form of an afro. So that's the assignment. But ultimately, what I propose is a return to the study of energetic exchange to reimagine a social that allows for the excess of interpersonal relations. I look at the technoaesthetic and not simply the ontogenic, because the technoaesthetic is applied as a tool in use by the individual to reconcile a sense of the lived experience of blackness. This is far beyond a historical memory. In this way, the technoaesthetic exceeds ontogenesis, which specifically addresses the incompleteness of form of the dynamic, mutable process of subjective creation. And 2 minutes, okay, I'll be really quick. And the reason why Simonden's theories don't fit well with traditional canons of hybridity, multiculturalism, or what I fear could happen with intersectionality is when you look at the ontogenic form, when you look at the form of subjectivity, the number one assumption is that the body is already fully formed, and that body fully formed is interacting with another body that's fully formed. And as we know now, especially in the continental philosophy heavy uni that we're in, that's a problematic starting point. And it's specifically related to hybridity. And that's why hybridity is a problem, because if you look at a hybrid engine, you have a gas engine, you have an electric engine. They're both assumed to be separate systems. The only necessity of their assumption is their relationship to make the car move. And if we continue to treat culture this way, you were over here, you function in isolation, you function in isolation, we will communicate only by necessity, it becomes problematic. And the issues that divorce difference and commonality will continue to be a problem unless we stop seeing life as a hybrid engine and start seeing it all as a necessary point of relation with a singular mission, which is to get the thing moving. So that's where I'm sort of going with this very political ethical message. But anyway, blackness here is a system of relation that communicates. Communicates via non-human mechanisms to inform the subjective response of both the black and non-black individual. This is why Simonden's theories are particularly important, especially when combined with the double consciousness theorized by Du Bois and the ontology of the interpersonal exchange illustrated by George Simmel. This space is far too limited to go into the importance of the technoaesthetic process to politics of difference in more detail, but I would like to say that this idea I'm proposing is a consideration of ways of coexistence that allow for new concepts of relation that challenge not only how, but why we live amongst others as we do. Blackness, at least in this study, can no longer survive as a reactionary dialectic, but must move beyond strategies of subjectivity that have by and large formed a monolithic representation of the black person with no consideration for the other. Blackness must become something else, a new axiom of continually disruptive relations. It must experiment with place, aesthetic, and sensation that both inform and propel the individual towards an energetic relation that acknowledges and accepts the irreducibility of the other to one's own experience and perception.